Bangladesh, there's a new openness, even for someone like myself who had spent a lot of time in Bangladesh, followed the country very
is to really create a space for discussion, to create a space for arguments, to create a space for people to talk freely and openly from different sides of the political spectrum, different sides of the political aisle, and also bring in diaspora voices, bring in young voices, bring in, and really be a platform for debate and discussion, because that's ultimately what's necessary.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you. There's a lot to talk about. Do you want to give our viewers a sense of what we're trying to accomplish here and how this fits in with the overall effort that you and the team at Counterpoint have to elevate the debate and discussion about developments in Bangladesh?
Sure, absolutely. So this is a joint venture between Brain and Counterpoint, which is a new weekly newspaper which I'm bringing out. And the Brain Network, of course, has done a number of these podcasts and shows in the past, and I think it's possibly well known to the audience here. The idea is, I think this is, what have we signed up for, John? I think this is going to be a fortnightly conversation between the two of us. And I love the idea that this is really going to be a conversation. And I think, certainly for today, what we're going to focus on is a little bit is that, what is the Bangladeshi diaspora doing and how to really knit the diaspora in to the national discussion. And I think sitting in Massachusetts and being a part of various initiatives and activities there in the United States, most recently, I believe there has been quite a high level conference symposium which took place. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the networks you're involved in, what work has been happening in the United States?
Sure. Well, at this point, I consider myself an honorary Bangladeshi,
I think
and
that
certainly,
that.
and certainly a friend of Bangladesh. And having been associated with the country for over 3 decades now, I've certainly seen an evolution in diaspora engagement with events back home. Certainly, the Bangladeshi diaspora has played a critical role over the years, including supporting development in Bangladesh through the remittances that are sent home. But we've seen, I think, an increased level of confidence and maturity of the diaspora in recent years. And certainly the events of last July and August were a catalyst for this. And we saw diaspora activism here in the United States, around the world, in support of those fighting for their freedom on the ground in Bangladesh. I've been fortunate through my association with a nonprofit organization, Right to Freedom, based in Washington, D.C., to participate in a number of discussions with diaspora groups. Along the way, I've been introduced to other organizations, including Brain, which has a foot in both worlds, or feet in many worlds. And as you mentioned, most recently, there was a collaboration on July 15th with a conference in Washington, D.C., which we can talk about. But I'd be interested from your perspective, how you see what's happening around the world involving the Bangladeshi diaspora and Friends of Bangladesh, and how that impacts events on the ground in Bangladesh.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's ironic in a sense, if you go all the way back to the Liberation War in 1971, there a crucial seminal role was played by the diaspora in terms of raising awareness, in terms of raising money, in terms of lobbying governments from Washington, D.C. to London to Paris and in New Delhi, of course. And then somehow I feel that in the intervening 50 plus years, there has been this disconnect largely between the diaspora Bangladeshis and events here on the ground, especially if you compare us to, the non-resident Indian community, you compare us to, let's say, overseas Chinese, who are really much more involved and influential when it comes to their domestic politics. And I think, there's been a lot of money left on the table here for Bangladesh. And one of the things which we saw last July, August was, as you said, this really crucial role which was played by the diaspora. And I think that's really opened the door. And then since then, we've seen greater engagement, greater involvement, greater activism. And I think that's a wonderful thing, because in this world in which we live in 2025, the diaspora Bangladeshis, at the end of the day, they're a resource which we need to use, and they can bring a lot of skills, a lot of understanding, a lot of expertise. And also, since we're living in this interconnected world, they really are, our sort of first point of contact with foreign governments as well as foreign peoples to tell the story of Bangladesh, because a big part of the success of any country and the success of any movement, and this includes the July uprising, which toppled Sheikh Hasina's dictatorial government, and is telling the story and telling our story and really controlling the narrative. And what we have seen in the past year, for instance, is that a lot of the narrative outside of Bangladesh has been attempted to be controlled by non-Bangladeshis, people who have a different agenda, who are trying to tell a different story. And I think it's really, I can say that at least at this stage, I think, our narrative is really winning out. And of course, we have the great advantage that our narrative happens to be true. I've worked with a lot of people who, who've been, well, how can we, change the discussion? And one of the things that you all came to, that this is an easy discussion to have, because when you have truth on your side, it really makes life a lot simpler and a lot easier. But creating these networks, creating these connections is also crucially important. It's no good having the truth on your side and having the narrative there if no one is actually hearing it, is being drowned out by hostile and negative voices. And I think this is really something we've seen, and hopefully it can really be a template for the future in terms of, as we try to build a new Bangladesh. I feel a big part of the new Bangladesh that we're going to build is a Bangladesh which really reaches out to the diaspora community and considers them as much a part of the nation and as much a part of the national conversation as those of us who are here in Bangladesh. And all of us have a role to play. Why don't you, on that note, tell us a little bit about this recent conference, which I think you were an integral part of?
Sure, and I'd be happy to do so. So much to talk about, including at some point I want to hear how Counterpoint fits into all this, because you talked about the narrative, and one of the things I think that's exciting about Counterpoint is that you're giving a platform to many of these voices, including those in the diaspora and around the world. So just as Bangladesh 2.0 is being built in Bangladesh, I think diaspora engagement 2.0 is what's happening overseas. There were always activities by members of the Bangladeshi diaspora with a view towards what was happening back home. In the political sphere, this manifested itself in the overseas branches of Bangladesh's political parties. And to be honest, much of that engagement was pretty toxic. So I think what we need to recognize is that still happens, those voices still exist, and it's not a homogeneous voice from outside. There are voices in the diaspora that are very critical, for example, of what happened last July and August and what's happened since. And we can talk about this later. Some of that has manifested itself in places like New Hampshire in the United States. I don't think that many people in New Hampshire in general speak of or think about Bangladesh. But recently we had an incident or an episode in which a group of Bangladeshi Americans introduced some legislation in New Hampshire, which presented a very, I think, warped view of what was happening in Bangladesh. So the diaspora mobilized to fight back. And what all of this helped lead to was the event last week, in which 3 different organizations, the organization that I head, Right to Freedom, a Washington-based nonprofit human rights group, the BRAIN Network, and another group, the Bangladesh America Alliance, came together and thought that we needed to do more to provide an objective, factual view of what's happening in Bangladesh, both to promote continued change in Bangladesh, but also to help influence the discussion in the United States. And our particular focus for this event on July 15th was the US Congress, which has an important voice in foreign affairs and has an important role to play more broadly in US-Bangladesh relations. So the event that took place on Capitol Hill, which is a pretty special place to have these kind of discussions. It was great to wander the halls of Congress and see the statues of past legislators and to bring together the group of people. It frankly, just as a practical matter, it's more convenient for members of Congress and staff to attend an event on Capitol Hill because they're all very busy during their time when they're in DC and not visiting their different constituencies. So the event kicked off with remarks by 2 members of Congress who have been longtime friends of Bangladesh and observers. Representative Lloyd Doggett, who represents the area around Austin, Texas, and Representative Jim McGovern, who just so happens to be my member of Congress, representing the 2nd District in Massachusetts. So both members of Congress spoke about the importance they place on democracy, human rights. They talked about their perspective on the events of last July and August, and they looked to the future about what was going to happen in terms of U.S.-Bangladesh relations and how we can ensure that there's no backsliding. The proceedings of the event are all available live on various social media platforms. Maybe we can put a link when this goes to air. So that was great. So the members of Congress kicked off the discussion, and then we went into two expert panels. One more inwardly focused, looking at the events of last July and August, looking at the progress of the reform processes, looking at some areas where the progress has not been maybe as much as we had hoped, and looking ahead to the future, to elections and beyond. The second panel took a broader look at Bangladesh 2.0 in the world. Certainly, there was a lot of focus on the U.S.-Bangladesh relations, with a particular eye to the economic and trade relationship, which is very much in the news these days as the two countries negotiate a framework agreement on trade. There was also a lot of discussion about Bangladesh's relationship with India. And then there was a broader look at the economic future of Bangladesh, how trade and investment will play into this. And we thought a little bit about how things might change or will change after elections when a new government comes in. So it was an exciting event. It was a great discussion. We had a broad range of people in the audience, from the members of Congress and their staff, representatives of the executive branch, the State Department, and others, a number of Bangladesh watchers in academia and think tank community, representatives of the diaspora from throughout the country, and then some very familiar and popular faces in Bangladesh, including my former boss, Ambassador Dan Mozina. So it was a great discussion. Sorry you weren't there in person. Hopefully you'll have a chance to watch online and give us some feedback. And then we're looking at what we can do in the future.
Okay, and would you say that it was a success in terms of really being able to tell Bangladesh's story? Because I think one of the problems we've had is that in Washington, D.C. and in America specifically, there is a very influential Indian lobby, to just bell the cat, and this current Indian government seems very inimical to the current government we have here in Bangladesh. I think it seems to me that kind of rhetoric, which we saw coming out in the first 6 to 8 months after August 5th, has toned down a little. But I think it's very, very important for Bangladesh to really have the capability and the capacity to fight back and tell our own story. So our story isn't really told by other people, especially it's not told by other people who have a vested interest in telling it a certain way, which really advances their national interest and not Bangladesh's national interest.
Yeah, so certainly one of the aspects that we've seen over the last year, and I've become much more attuned to, is the amount of misinformation and disinformation that circulates, whether it's online, in foreign capitals, in traditional and new media. So that's certainly been the case in Bangladesh. And as I've reflected on this, I think one of the reasons why this takes place and why it's so pernicious is because so few people in the United States have that firsthand experience in Bangladesh, the kind of on-the-ground reality. So everything that they're thinking and hearing about Bangladesh is filtered, including through people who have their own agenda. One of the most positive things, I think, since last August has been the degree to which Bangladesh has kind of opened itself up to the world again. As you probably know better than most, during the 15 years of the previous government, it became increasingly difficult for outsiders, whether they be journalists, academics, representatives of think tanks, to even get visas to visit Bangladesh. So the previous government was very much trying to control the narrative. Now, they weren't fully able to do that, and I'm glad that was the case, that people found a way to have their voices be heard. But it was a very difficult environment, which you and others faced firsthand. So now there's a new Bangladesh, there's a new openness. Even for someone like myself, who had spent a lot of time in Bangladesh, followed the country very closely, it was a huge eye-opener for me when I visited in March, just for 2 weeks, just a few months back, to actually see the situation on the ground, to talk to people myself. So we couldn't transport all of the people who were in a conference room on Capitol Hill to Bangladesh, but we brought together some experts, including some people, from the diaspora, but others of us who had actually been to Bangladesh since last July and August, and some of whom had been there very recently, to share their perspectives. The other thing which I would say, and again, when we talk a little bit more about Counterpoint, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this. There's some people who will say, well, if this side is lying, then we have to do the same. You fight fire with fire. But I think my experience and my approach to this is you don't fight fire with fire, you fight fire with water. And what you do if somebody is lying is you tell the truth, and that increases your own credibility. So it's not as if the speakers at our conference all were singing off a sheet of music which had been written by the interim government or by any specific group. We had some healthy disagreements. And I think that's the key going forward. And it was interesting. One of the topics we discussed, which I know is very controversial in Bangladesh, is the issue of women's rights and the outcome of the Commission on Reform focusing on women's issues. I had one of the speakers, a professor at NYU, Dr. Dina Siddiqui, spoke on this topic. And, I was expecting that she had come from a certain background and was going to present only one side of the story. But much to her credit, she presented a very balanced viewpoint. And her biggest takeaway was that regardless of what happens with implementation of this commission's recommendations, what's most important is actually people are talking about these subjects. And subjects which had previously been taboo weren't even discussed. And now there's an environment in Bangladesh and around the world in which people can have these discussions. So that, to me, was one of the most hopeful takeaways.
Okay, and I think that's a good segue for me to tell a little bit about what Counterpoint is and what our goal is. I should say at this point that back when I was myself a member of the Diaspora community living and working in New York City, I was part of a diaspora group called Drishtipath, many of the alumni of which are doing other things. One is Asif Saleh, who is the executive director of BRAC today. He came back to Bangladesh around the same time I did 22 years ago. Jyoti Rahman is now, among many other things, is working with me as the executive editor of Counterpoint. And so one of the things we're really trying to do is we're trying to recreate sort of that space here in Bangladesh. And what's fascinating is, if you recall, there was during July when internet was shut down here in Bangladesh, a lot of the information which people were getting was then taken up by people living outside the country who nevertheless were very tightly involved with what was going on in the ground. You had organizations like Netra News, you had other individuals who were working in their individual capacity. And that was really a big part of how of course, we were here on the ground doing everything we could, but this also kept the story alive outside of Bangladesh. It was, in fact, a great source of comfort and a great source of strength to those of us who were here. So the idea has always been to try and knit these communities back together again, and really to show that it's not two different communities we need to be knitted together. It's really one community, just in sort of two different places. Counterpoint is, as you know, until recently, I was the editor of Dhaka Tribune. I was there for 12 years, which is a daily national newspaper. What I want to do now is I want to really focus on what essentially is my first love, journalistically speaking, which is comment and analysis and opinion. And it's what I used to do before. I was editor of a magazine called Forum. I was the op-ed editor at the Daily Star also for almost 10 years. And the idea is to really create a space for discussion, to create a space for arguments, to create a space for people to talk freely and openly from different sides of the political spectrum, different sides of the political aisle, and also bring in diaspora voices, bring in young voices, and really be a platform for debate and discussion, because that's ultimately what's necessary. It's not important for everyone to agree. When something happens in Bangladesh, let's say, for instance, just recently there was this quite controversial march on Gopalganj. What we tried to do is we tried to publish pieces, including one by you, which really discussed it from different points of view and let the readers read and make up their own mind. And I think that's such an important principle, and that's really kind of a principle which we had lost over the last decade or so, when that space had been squeezed here in Bangladesh, in terms of what could be said and what couldn't be said. And as you say, there's no point really replacing, one set of taboos with another. It's really important to have these open discussions. And as you say, issues such as women's rights, how are we going to coexist with people who may be more religious, maybe more conservative, may have a different point of view from you and I, as to the direction Bangladesh can go. These are all conversations that we need to have. We cannot simply bulldoze over and say, well, this is how it's going to be. There's going to be just one way of looking at it. There's going to be just one way of thinking about it. And so that's really what we're trying to do here at Counterpoint. We're creating a platform And Jyoti and I have been working very closely together on this. It's already been launched online. It's counterpointbd.com. We hope to get our print declaration fairly soon. That's, of course, a whole other story because it's a massive procedure. These things take 4 or 5 months. I really have no idea why. I recently got my special branch clearance. That is one of the signatures you need, and of course it was very very courteous and very cordially done. And I was happy to show up and give my presentation. But it's interesting that of course you still have these this red tape. You still have these various signatures you need to gather, these various hoops you need to jump through, so that these things change slowly. But hopefully one of the things which I see the interim government is working on, and I hope that whoever comes in after the next elections will continue, is sort of a deregulation, allowing people more freedom to do things, allowing them more freedom to breathe. I mean, this freedom comes in many forms, in many guises. It's not just freedom of the press. It's not just freedom of speech. It's also freedom to set up your own business. It's also freedom to set up your own nonprofit. It's also freedom to really live your life as you see fit, as long as you are not impinging on anyone else's rights. And so I think, again, like I said, these are the discussions which I hope to highlight in Counterpoint. I know there are many other media organizations in Bangladesh who I think are doing a great job. So I'm very proud to be part of that community. I'm proud to add something to that discussion. You see, I mean, there's a very specific niche we're trying to fill. Initially, I remember there have been weekly publications such as Holiday, which I'm not sure if you remember your time in Bangladesh, and then also Forum, which had 2 incarnations. The first one was actually in the 1960s, all the way up to 1971, 69 to 71. And then the second incarnation, where I edited it, where it was a monthly, where you had slight space for these long form kind of discussions, something similar to, let's say, The Atlantic in America, or The Nation, New Republic, maybe the New Yorker. And I feel that there was a gap there in the market. And so we're really there as a complement to the daily newspapers, the TV stations. And I think it's going to work very well, hopefully.
No, that's fantastic. And hopefully these conversations that you and I will have on a regular basis will supplement that. Right. And I'm sure there'll be some back and forth between what we're reading and writing in the pages of Counterpoint and what we're discussing here in this forum. So that's fantastic and exciting. Just reflecting on what you've said, and again, thinking about the work we've done, I think it's also important to remember that Bangladeshis have agency, whether they're in Bangladesh or around the world. And one of the risks, of course, of engagement in a capital like Washington and having discussions about Bangladesh is that this can feed into a narrative about, the foreign hand or the deep state, and a thought that machinations and decisions in Washington are what influence and determine events in Bangladesh. In my experience, it's 100% the opposite. I'll be in Dhaka next week speaking at a couple of events marking the 1-year anniversary. And part of what I hope to do is some myth busting. I remember waking up on August 5th last year and seeing what was happening, and then reaching out to some of my former colleagues at the State Department. And one of the things that became immediately apparent to me is that people in Washington were caught by surprise by the rapidity with which things developed in Bangladesh. And hearing from others, I think people were caught by surprise in New Delhi and other capitals as well. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to raise awareness about Bangladesh. We're trying to increase voices. The US and other friends of Bangladesh obviously have roles to play. And my hope as an American citizen, as a friend of Bangladesh, is that the US will pursue policies in Bangladesh that ultimately benefit both countries. I think everyone in the room felt the same way, including the diaspora. One of the things that's been apparent to me is as the diaspora has matured, as you have second and third generation Bangladeshi Americans engaging, they care about both countries. As one of the speakers said, and maybe it wasn't original to them, but it was the first time I had heard that this said this way, they said that Bangladesh gave them roots and America gave them wings. So I thought that was a wonderful way to encapsulate the dynamic of what's happening. So what we're trying to do from this side with Right to Freedom, with the partnership with other organizations, is to provide information about Bangladesh, to provide thoughts about how the Bangladesh-US relationship can be strengthened, provide a platform for people visiting from Bangladesh or engaging, But we do so with a view very much that the decisions about the future are going to be taking place in Bangladesh. Those discussions need to take place in virtual forms and real forms, but ultimately decisions are made on the ground in Dhaka. And one of the issues that we can talk about maybe on a future podcast as we look ahead towards elections is how the diaspora's voice will most directly be heard. For example, there's a lot of discussion about having diaspora vote in Bangladeshi elections. And I'm sure there are many Bangladeshis in the United States or Bangladeshi Americans who would like to exercise that right. Maybe when they were in Bangladesh over the last 15 years, they didn't have that opportunity. There's huge numbers of Bangladeshis elsewhere, including all of the expatriate workers. So I'm sure, again, that's one of the discussions that is taking place in Dhaka, including with the political parties, is how to mobilize the diaspora, how the political parties can get support from outside groups, including the intellectual capital with many diaspora voices trying to contribute to the platforms of the parties, and then ultimately, with the vote. So yeah, it's an exciting new world, and this is maybe how technology and platforms like this podcast can help, because now people who previously were far away, geographically from what was happening in Dhaka have an opportunity to contribute to that debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you say it's a really important point you make about there's a lot of conspiratorial thinking, or there has been in the past a lot of conspiratorial thinking in Bangladesh. Anytime anything happens, even fully domestically, there's always people trying to read the tea leaves and saying, well, why is this happening? What is the understory, the counter story? And then this, of course, manifests itself when it comes to big events, and people are always trying to look for a foreign hand, be it the hand of the United States or the hand of another country. And I think part of that comes from this really misapprehension many Bangladeshis have of their own country and of their own selves, where they think that, Bangladesh is a small country, and that none of these things can actually happen with the agency of the Bangladeshi people. And we can't ever hope to be anything except, a cat's paw of a greater power, whether it was like, sort of Cold War politics back in the 1970s, or, whether we're going to be sucked into sort of an India-China conflict here in Bangladesh, or whether the US played a role. Whereas actually now, you think about, a country of 175 million, the economy is growing by leaps and bounds. I don't think it is accurate to think of Bangladesh as a small country anymore. And I think it's very important for us to realize that, our destiny is in our own hands. And what happens, nothing can happen in Bangladesh without it being the prime moves of it being Bangladeshis. And this is, of course, what we saw in July, culminating in August 5th. And I do think that a lot of the discourse you see, which looks towards a foreign hand, really does a disservice to the Bangladeshi people to suggest that they don't have agency, and that, and I think it sort of really doesn't look at the efforts and the sincerity with which many, and it wasn't just a new generation of Bangladesh, but I would specifically like to mention the younger generation and what they have done, and recognize that, and in terms of, rather than thinking that, well, there was someone else behind this. And again, I think the more people talk about this, the more people understand, and I think those voices, those skepticism, those doubts are really being washed away. One of the things we are trying to do here on this podcast, and it's something, again, which I'm also trying to do at Counterpoint, and I think there are other platforms doing so, is to really give Bangladesh a voice on the global stage. Because one of the things which we have lacked in compared to our neighbors is that voice. We have a lot of very, very great communicators in media personalities, but a lot of it is in Bangla, which is, of course, all well and good, as should be in a Bangla-speaking country. But what it does do is it leaves the field open for those who have a greater presence on the world stage. So one of the things we're trying to do here, and I think it is important, is we need to talk to and engage with people on the ground in Bangladesh, but it is also very important for Bangladesh to engage with the world community, and it can start with the diaspora Bangladeshis, but really it's all of us. And I think that's a big part of what this podcast, which you and I hope to be doing fortnightly, it's a big part of what I'm hoping to accomplished with Counterpoint. And as I said, I think it's a big part of what a lot of these platforms and networks are doing. And I think it can only really be to our advantage, to our benefit as a country. And I think it's really long overdue, and I'm really glad to see it happening.
No, absolutely. I mean, and you hit the nail on the head that there's a rich inward focused conversation happening in Bangladesh on platforms like Facebook and innumerable WhatsApp groups and traditional media, television, etc. But it's happening in Bangla. So the rest of the world, despite the advances in artificial intelligence, which make it easier to hit the Google Translate button, which I do from time to time, it's hard sometimes to tap into that internal conversation. So the reality is, if Bangladesh wants to talk to the world's language is English in many cases. And certainly among the elites that Bangladesh is trying to talk to, those who are thinking about how their countries or their organizations engage in Bangladesh. So this is definitely a niche that needs to be filled, and hopefully we can play a small role in doing that. There's lots of opportunities, I think, and certainly the events of the last year showed, to engage on X, the X platform, formerly Twitter. There's a growing community of people having discussions about Bangladesh. There are opportunities for the media. There are opportunities for these online platforms. So I think having that discussion is important. It doesn't replace the discussion that is happening and has to happen internally within Bangladesh, but hopefully it will supplement it.
Right. And I think on that note, I feel our time is up for this particular episode, but I shall talk to you again here on this podcast in another 2 weeks. And I hope those of you who are tuning in will join us. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. I think we are going to build on the themes and the topics we've discussed here. And of course, we're going to be talking a little bit about what are the issues of the day and what everyone is talking about in Bangladesh, and also what everyone's talking about insofar as it relates to Bangladesh.
Great. I look forward to those future discussions as well. And I'm particularly looking forward to the topics we're going to disagree about, and how we can model agreeably disagreeing and having a real debate and discussion about topics which I know are important to people in Bangladesh and the world, and in which people have different perspectives.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Thanks, Savra.
Okay. But thank you, John. And thank you, all of those who've tuned in, and catch us again 2 weeks from now, August 1st.